everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often those writers have been recommended to me by previous guests of the show, unless it's a Rejoinder episode, which this is. Garett Strickland was on the show back in August of 2021 to talk about his book Ungula through Inside the Castle, and he's back now to talk about his book, multimedia project, etc., called SCRIMS through Cloak. Links to both of those projects will be in the show notes. Before we get into the show, let's talk about how you can support the show. You can do it on a monthly basis at patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. Sidebar, big thanks to Zach Smith for pointing out that I was putting the wrong link for the Patreon in all those show notes. It should be correct sometime in the near future now. Nevertheless, patreon.com/noisemakerjoe is the link you can just type in because you heard me say it. paypal.me/noisemakerjoe is a good place for a one-time donation, or you can buy my book. It's called Tired. If you have no money to give, either by necessity or desire, you can just give the show a appropriate rating on whatever place you're using to listen to it, so long as that place has ratings. Or retweet the tweets, etc., etc. Also, big thanks to Jesse Hilson and Last Estate for the interview that he did of me. Last.estate is a good place to go. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Garett. The new project, I suppose we can call it. I'm tempted to call it a book, but that's, I don't know. That might make people
I think
grumpy.
of it as, yeah.
It's called SCRIMS. It's out now for free on Cloak. You download a zip file, you unzip the files, and there's 10 of them there. We've got some PNGs, we've got some MOVs, we got an MP3, and a couple of PDFs.
Yeah.
And
although you can, there's a suggested donation. You can donate whatever you want.
yes, so. Do that. Don't be like me. Give them money. I'm on the Cloak Patreon, so I think.
Yeah.
I think that kicks to you guys, doesn't it? I think that's how that works.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of like that helps take care of the overhead for everything.
Okay. We'll tell you what, listener, do both. After you've gone over to my Patreon, go over to that one, and yes, there's a suggested donation. So let's talk about how this project came about. Was it a multimedia thing from the start, or is this like you had writings lying around that you've decided to collect?
Mm-hmm. This is, it's kind of a long road, and a weird one, because I think probably in 2017, I'm guessing because it was a while ago, I went through and harvested phrases from two different texts. One is the book It Then by Danielle Colbert, this French writer who, she wasn't all that prolific, and there's only been a few things that were translated into English, but that's a really important book to me. And then the other book was, well, it was a text called People Walking Away by Roberto Bolaño, which is kind of like the uncut, extended version of what became his book Antwerp. But it's all in his collected poetry book, Unknown University. So that was kind of interesting because it's like Antwerp is presented as a short novel, but I mean it reads like prose poetry, and like so there was more there. So I went through both of those and I wrote down phrases on pieces of paper, and then I cut them all up and folded them, and I put them in a container on my like desk in my office, and they sat there for like no less than 4 years. At some point I bought like a very particular bowl to put them in. And then I dedicated time to drawing those phrases out as prompts and then writing text from those phrases. And then, so there's two sections of text. I mean, there's really four. So like, there are two files that are, you're sort of seeing the prompts of those original phrases. And then you're sort of seeing the sequenced text that resulted from those prompts. But between the first iteration and the second iteration, there was like a randomization. And then I re-sculpted the text from that.
Okay.
So it's kind of strange because it was like this big cauldron of potentiality that was just sitting around for a long time, that I like knew I was going to use at some point, but I wasn't really sure in what context.
Right.
So, and then just one day I was like, okay, like, you know, I had like another thing that I had in mind to do for Cloak, and I was like, well, that's taking a little bit longer. So like, how about I do this? And that's kind of what I initially presented, was those two iterations.
Okay. Yeah. So that was like, I don't know. One of the first things I picked up on was like, oh, okay, there's the red half and the blue half. But that's very interesting to. I like the durational quality of it. In the last episode, I talked to Kat Giordano about her book that just came out, which was like very emotionally charged poetry she wrote back in like 2018 that she just kind of kept around and then decided to publish now. And so they're like, it's different, right? But it's the durational quality of writing is something that I think needs to have more respect given to it, maybe. There's a story from a podcast I was listening to once. These fantasy writers or science fiction SF people were talking about how they like went to some conference, maybe it was even AWP, I don't know, and would like see one of their literary fiction writer friends who were like, oh yeah, you know, I think I've been working on this book for like 5 years and I think I'm almost done. And the SF people were like, how does it take that long to write a book? You plan for 6 months and then you write the first book, you send it to the publisher and you say, hey, I got 9 more in the series. What do you want?
Yeah.
And obviously two very different types of writing. And at, you know, at this level of abstraction and experimentation and artfulness, we're in a whole different like universe, it kind of seems sometimes. But I like that idea that, you know, you just sort of waited till you were ready, even if that wasn't necessarily the intent.
Yeah, I just like needed to cohabitate with it, like as an entity. I mean, that's kind of how it feels with a lot of the stuff for me. It's like I spend a lot of time thinking about a project before I execute it most of the time, or it just takes that long to make happen. So
do you ever get worried that you'll like, I don't know, forget or like never get around to it or something? Because I got a million ideas that are like on scraps of paper and in notes on my phone and stuff like that, that I'm always kind of like, you know, I feel the urge to write so that I can finish whatever I'm doing to get to the thing I just thought of. And there's like an anxiety around that for me. I don't know if that's something you feel or if you're more at peace with the way that things work for you.
Yeah, I mean, I have like at least 5 other books planned, and some, you know, and I'm always thinking about them and kind of shaping them in my imagination, even if I'm working on other stuff. But I mean, it's all kind of part of the same tapestry. And so I think that like there are things that I thought about as, you know, like, oh, this could be a book or whatever. And then by the time I get around to like writing it down, it's just almost like it gets condensed to the thing, or it's just like, well, I can just like talk about that idea as though it's an already existent thing, like in this like Borgesian kind of way. It's like, okay, like you can just do an imaginary review of a book that doesn't exist, and it's a short story, and like that's the execution of that idea. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, like I'm not much of a maximalist in my thinking about things anyway. So the fact that it kind of gets like boiled down, and then like what feels essential about it sort of floats to the surface, and then like can kind of be maybe embedded in another project, or, you know, there's a kind of intertextuality or something, you know. I think that there are ideas that are like nascently present in Ungula that like will get spun off into other things, you know, like if anybody's going to be paying close enough attention, they will probably be able to like map those things eventually. But, you know, I don't know that they need to, or that it's necessary or anything, you know.
Right.
But it's just kind of echoes that run back and forth through the things that you make.
Yeah, that's something that we've talked about, you know, off the air, is continuities and portals in your work, like within particular works and then between them. And I think that's an interesting thing too. It's sort of like a more abstracted version of what like Mike Klein does, right? Where it's like all of my stuff is definitely in the same universe.
Right, and he like mapped it out even.
He did do
like,
that one time, and it was, you know, about as helpful as one might expect it to would have been.
Yeah. That's kind of one thing that is, I was talking to somebody the other day about how the idea of like multiversal thinking became a mainstream idea, especially with like the Marvel shit. But like, you know, I mean, I think that like you can point to all sorts of other like cultural touchstones where it's just kind of been like, it stopped blowing people's mind as a concept a while ago. And then it's kind of, it's helpful though. I think part of it is that it's a way for people to dodge a sense of mortality, you know, because they're like, I'm always also over there doing another thing, you know, like no matter what happens to me here, which is legitimate. And I don't think that that's like not true or anything.
Yeah.
But I think that is maybe why it's become a more popular concept in the cultural imagination, because it doesn't matter if you're secular or not. You're just kind of like, well, science says that I'm everywhere all the time. So that's cool. Like I'm less stressed out now as a result.
Yeah. Somewhere out there's a universe where I've got everything together and I'm not worried about money and my back doesn't hurt.
All of my books already.
Yeah. I think too, there's I talk often with the more poetic people on the show about how I had a professor one time who said that poetry is not a riddle to be solved. But I think that, and I agree in so many places, but I do like looking at like your work, and being like, yeah, I bet there's a riddle in there somewhere. Like, I bet I could go full ARG and like get like 10 people in a Discord channel, and before you know it, some YouTuber will have a 45-minute video about like, you know, what's the real story of the of the Strickland verse.
What's the end of SCRIMS mean?
And I like that. Like, I think that within within working with media, it's a way of engaging with the work longer than just the time it takes to consume it and maybe like do a review, right? Like, treating it like it's a case for a detective to solve is just like gives more of it there. And I don't know, like, you can look back at like those weird Tumblr fandom conspiracy theories, like, no, it was a fake Sherlock episode. It wasn't the real finale. The real finale is like hidden somewhere on some dark web URL that you have to decode through the first couple episodes of the season. But yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that they're you know, for example, I'm a big fan of David Lynch, who famously doesn't like to speak to the work because he says that the work, you know, does all the talking. That, you know, it would be limiting for him to nail anything down. But to this point, I discovered in a very detective-like way that so did you watch Twin Peaks: The Return?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, at the end he describes the extreme negative force that became known as Judy as Jiao Day.
Mm-hmm.
And Jiao Day in Chinese means explain. So I love the idea that in David Lynch's universe that the like source of all evil is explanation, which charts, you know, makes sense for him. And then he already kind of gave us about us, like, you know, he's like, here's as close as I can get to, you know, explaining whatever this thing is that I'm talking about within the course of the series or whatever. But I mean, I think that when you allow room for abstraction, or, I mean, I love ambiguity, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that it's important for people to be able to come to a work multiple times, and based on wherever they are, the room they're in, the time in their life, what they're going through, like, to be able to get something totally different out of it. So I don't really want it to be this like one and done experience ever, you know?
Yeah.
I don't enjoy experiencing art that way myself. So I'm not trying to make anything that would be like that.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense.
But I'm not trying to be dodgy either. I don't like, you know, when people are negatively defined that way, where they're just like, well, I hate this thing, so I'm going to do something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think there's something to that. I think particularly like with the more abstract stuff, I don't like to try to even define it like within myself. Like, if someone were to ask me what is SCRIMS about, I'd say, I don't know. Throw $3 at it and read it.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't take you super long to get through it the first time. And you can go about your day and think about it and come back to it later. But I like how I'll like accidentally kind of figure something out when it comes to stuff like that. I was watching the streaming service Shudder has a 4-part nonfiction show called Queer for Fear that goes through the history of queerness in horror films and stuff. And in the lesbian episode, they were talking about Mulholland Drive, and just like one of the women there had this like queer theory reading of Mulholland Drive that like never would have thought of that myself. And it's like, oh, okay, so the next time I watch that movie, I can think about like that experience, that thing, but it doesn't like solve Mulholland Drive for me, but it is like a very concrete reading of the film that makes sense within the logic of the film. But like, because I've sat with the not knowing, and like long periods of time in between watching it and thinking about it and talking to anybody about it, like it's still a sort of just ethereal thing for me.
Yeah. I mean, the last time I watched that, I had a really, like, a totally different experience of it than I had previously. And I wept like a child, and it was just like, but it was unique once again to like what I was going through and sort of the situation that I was in. But it's you know, and I could speak to my own take on it, but I think that with his stuff in particular, like the sort of just discontinuity that he works with is to the benefit of the viewer as a participant. So, and that's something that I really believe very strongly in, that the reader or the viewer, you know, I don't want to say consumer of media because that seems so passive and one-sided. I actually think that, like, if you were to say that you were absorbing the stuff, that would also seem passive, but it's actually a very active thing. You're doing a lot whenever you're experiencing something. And it is an experiential process, and it helps create the thing. Like when I was watching The Return for the first time, especially towards the end where things slow down a lot, I felt like what I was doing, like the attention that I was giving the film was like co-authoring what was happening, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I hope I don't fuck up and make a mistake, you know, otherwise everything's going to be ruined. And I think that, like, you know, obviously you think about like, well, this was a production and, you know, it happened before, you know, but like, if you really want to get down to it, like there's really, when you're absorbing and experiencing something, there's really nothing separating you from the thing, you know? It's like all of those like contrivances that you might think of like, oh, well, this had to be funded and then they filmed it there and then it like, you know, had to be like broadcast or whatever, like detracts from the fact that like we're part of a unified neural network, you know, and there's screens don't really have screens in them, you know, like there's nothing like separating you from what you're experiencing that way, you know. There was a performance artist that I saw once who was talking about Bill Gates. I don't know if we talked about this before, but he was like, well, why didn't Bill Gates call Windows Gates?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it just like maybe he was being humble or something? But also, like, the idea of a window is totally different from the idea of a gate. Like, a window separates you from the thing that you're looking at. It's a different kind of like cultural technique than a gate, which implies all of this presence.
Yeah.
It doesn't filter anything out. Which probably he was like, well, if I call it gates, like, not only do I seem arrogant, like, I'm also like sort of inviting a kind of presence into the situation that, like, culturally maybe we don't want, or something like that. But all of which is to say that, like, there isn't anything separating you most of the time. You're really present in like what you're looking at, then you're as much there as the people who made it, the person who made it or authored it, because you're fulfilling like a part of like an open circuit.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the film is happening when you're watching it, like, even though it's a completed thing. So I agree kind of in that sense that, like, it's only happening for you when you're making it happen. And I think that I've been thinking a lot about the Inside the Castle tweet that goes out every now and again, the style is substance tweet. How, like, the most important part about something like your work, or something like a lot of the Inside the Castle stuff, or David Lynch movies, or like Skinamarink or something, like, the most important part about it is like the act of experiencing it, which makes it really hard to do a podcast about it because I can't, like, like, I bringing back Mike Klein, like, I have this problem where, like, I know what I feel, but I do not have the language for it. And you'd think after however long, 5 years of doing the show, I'd have figured out some sort of language. But I don't. I just sometimes I can't quite figure out even exactly like what it is I'm doing, which I think, like, for a lot of the writers, I think is like a good thing, but as a person who's like supposed to be the arbiter of some sort of information for a listener, I feel deficient. And it's like, yeah, this book is good, read it. That's like all that's all I got.
Right. Yeah, I mean, trying to discover what to say about the thing, it can be, but I think as much as the like object itself is essentially involves like not just me as the person who made it, but whoever encounters it. The same way, I just think that, like, talking about a thing is not separate from, the creative process of making something either. I was doing some cultural research about this guy, Gordon Matta Clark, who I guess he's most famous is making these architectural cuts in buildings where he would sort of cut out like facades and like the sort of core of a building in such a way that, like, light would play through it, create this sort of environment. But most of his work happened in buildings that were about to be torn down and stuff like that. So all you really have is the documentation of the work. There are people who can attest to like having been there and walked through it and like what that was like. But it seemed like a big part of his project that it was ephemeral, and he was also very inventive in the way that he talked about the work. So he didn't consider the talk as being, promotion. Like he would discover ideas through talking through the ideas, like, so they would get larger for him through the conversations that were being had. And to that extent, like this conversation is still an extension of SCRIMS, It's just taking the SCRIM further. But that said, I guess we haven't really like talked that much about like what it actually is. But
look at what it's doing, what it calls trying, picking up the torn hide of its intentions. Just like scrolling through one of the bigger PDFs, and that like popped out at me as I zoomed in close enough to be able to read it, and that seemed like the work is mocking me now. Which I like. I don't know, like, because normally I want to talk about like the construction, right? Like, how did you decide to make the PDFs kind of that size, those dimensions that like you'd have to zoom in? I suppose you can answer that question too. Like I'm kind of making fun of myself.
Yeah, that was Correo. So okay. I like, I liked, he encountered the initial text and he was like, I kind of like see it. I like the idea of it being this big file that you have to like zoom in and scroll through, and that it's not necessarily even like, you can make an argument for it being sequential, but you don't have to encounter it that way, which I like that it's open-ended that way too. And that felt smart to me,
Yeah.
So
I think maybe, I think one of the reasons why I didn't really ask about the construction that much is because after my conversation with Logan about Rectum, kind of just got the sense that that's probably going to be the case for all this cloak stuff, is that Mike has a really big hand in forming what people see at the end of it, which is I don't know. I guess that's pretty unique in terms of like what the publisher does. I'm not sure now. I feel like my only comparison, I guess, is like Inside the Castle, but I think that a lot of that kind of like is more collaborative. Well, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, John made a lot of design decisions for Ungula, but like my next Inside the Castle book that comes out in October, Correo is designing, and I'm in the midst of finishing that up right now. And like, it's so design heavy that I'm like trying to give him a 6-month runway, to put it together. That said, we'll see, but that sort of relationship between like designer, publisher, and author or artist is, it's pretty liberating. I mean, it's not like if you didn't like a choice that got made, like you wouldn't be able to veto it or something. But I think it's just that he thinks of stuff that you wouldn't, which is cool. I think that there's too much pressure anymore that everybody has to do everything for themselves, and like, it sounds so like dumb to be like, oh, it would be cool to like have an agent or a publicist or something like that. But I mean, that wasn't that uncommon before. But at the same time, those are people who are just kind of like, one way of thinking about it is that that sort of specialization is adding a middleman that doesn't need to be there or something. And then the other side of it is like, well, that's not my thing. I don't know how to do that. Somebody else does, so it would be nice to have them do that, you know. And I don't know shit about design. I don't know how to use InDesign or anything like that. I don't even know. I haven't used Photoshop since I was like 18 years old. So I want to be able to make a lot of these things happen. I can like stand over somebody's shoulder and like tell them to do something differently, but that's about it. So it's not going to get anywhere close to as beautiful as I want it to be without that kind of collaboration. So I'm really thankful that I am able to collaborate with people who know what they're doing that way and like have vision of how to do things differently, because most people just kind of like follow the same templates, it seems like, you know.
Yeah, I think that that Mike's in a good position where it seems like he's doing quite a lot of that, right? Like, it seems like he's kind of, as far as I can tell, like making his living designing books and whatnot and related activities, which means that he's just doing it more than anybody else we know. And
yeah,
and
he's able to teach himself really well to like pick up a lot real quick through like tutorials and stuff like that, which is like, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm old or like lack that kind of like ambition of being able to sort of like learn new skill sets. But I think that, you know, there's all that like you can't teach an old dog new tricks thing. And I don't know that that's true, but like it depends on how stubborn the dog is, I guess.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying, it's nice to have a team. Like, it's nice to know that between, you know, the Google Doc and the reader, that there's going to be people who take care to make the thing as good as it can be, which I think kind of in this ecosystem, we lack some of those people for a variety of reasons. I think it's easy to blame money, but I think there's other reasons too. And yeah, I don't know, like team building beyond community building, you know, like,
yeah,
have 4 good friends and make sure they all have different skills and make something beautiful together.
Like anybody who's ever been in a band like knows how difficult it is to organize collective time. So I never really blame people when they're like, oh, I don't, you know, have a lot of time for this, especially like if it involves like working for free, you know. But that's why it's good to find people who are just like naturally enthusiastic about the same stuff, which can take a lot of time.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So before we finish up here, then I think I think what do you want someone to keep in mind when they dig into SCRIMS?
I think that more and more I'm interested in making work that, you know, and it's present in, you know, a book as much as it might be in like a multimedia thing where you're having like unmediated. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about mediation, And it's funny because obviously it exists in media, it's multimedia or intermedia, but it should feel unmediated, you know? So there being a visual aspect, like an audio aspect, like if you're looking at a piece of visual art or you're hearing a song, you have a more direct kind of encounter with that, I think. And more that's kind of like what I'm getting at with any of the stuff that I'm making. So you know, it's an effort to be present so much as I'm able to. So like with SCRIMS, it kind of feels like I'm like embedded in the membrane of mediation and kind of like trying to speak from inside that in-between space. And that would be the case no matter what, but I think in particular with like incorporating singing or any of that kind of thing, like increasingly incorporating visual art or having like audio components and things like that in the work that I make feels really important, because I want people to have that kind of experience where it's like, you know, if you post text on like Instagram or something like that, like I feel like people like, well, Inside the Castle, you know, like, well, John will post, you know, like looking at books instead of reading books as like an imperative. And, you know, I agree with that because, you know, like the thing should be beautiful. It should be fun to look at. It shouldn't feel like, you know, because if you post a page of something, then like, I think the average person's reaction is just like, oh, now I've got work to do, you know, like now I have to like read this thing instead of like have some sort of like immediate kind of encounter with it. They don't think of it as being immediate. They think of it as something else that you have to do. Yeah, like an investment. And then there's like, well, I'm not going to bother. Like too long didn't apply to like pretty much anything, you know, especially on social media. I mean, if somebody buys a book, obviously hopefully they want to read it, you know, but I just think that there are all these other ways of using text or image or sound that like is almost kind of more holistic or something, you know. So I guess that's like how I would hope that somebody might encounter it. That said, there's no way of guaranteeing that. So like, you know, whatever works is fine.